And a very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning and welcome, everyone. My name is Andy Clom, and I have the pleasure of being the acting head of the European Commission representation here in Ireland. And I'm most delighted to see so many of you joining us this morning for a very special webinar. We're very delighted that there's such a strong interest in this event with Eamon Gilmore, the EU Special Representative for Human Rights, on the very topic of the EU and human rights. Now, as some of you might know, Eamon has been the EU's Special Representative for Human Rights since 2019. In this role, he is responsible for enhancing the effectiveness and visibility of EU human rights policy. Human rights is an issue that concerns everyone. And in a shifting global geopolitical landscape, the EU has remained steadfast as a defender of human rights and democracy worldwide. Eamon is, of course, the former Tánaiste and Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade of Ireland. And prior to his current role, Eamon served as the EU Special Envoy for the peace process in Colombia. In terms of today's running order, Eamon will present his work as the EU's Special Representative for Human Rights and speak about the EU's role in the protection and promotion of human rights. After Eamon's presentation, he will then answer as many questions as possible on these topics. In practical terms, we have up to around about 11:30. And if you would like to ask a question, please send your question to the following email: events@europeanmovement.ie. I'll repeat that, events@europeanmovement.ie. And I believe the email address is also shown at the bottom of the screen. If you want to be active on social media, please do so. Today's hashtag is #EUHumanRights. Eamon, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you today. We're very privileged that you've been able to make some time from your schedule to join us, and I would like to hand over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Andy. Thank you and the Dublin office of the European Commission, and I thank also Noel and our colleagues in European Movement Ireland for inviting me to participate in this event today. Since I left public office in Ireland, I've had the great privilege of working to promote the values on which the European Union is founded. As you said, since 2015, I've been the European Union Special Envoy for the peace process in Colombia, a role, incidentally, in which I am continuing, because the High Representative has asked me to continue to double hat, so to speak, between that role and my role as the Special Representative for Human Rights, which was a role that I began in February of 2019, when I replaced Stavros Lambrinidis, my predecessor, when he in turn moved to Washington as the European Union's ambassador to the United States in replacement of David O'Sullivan. So in a way, there's been a kind of an Irish interest at both ends of that transition. So I have seen at first hand, and I've been able to participate in the work that the European Union does on values. And although I've been in public life for a very long time, it's been a learning experience for me, because I have to confess that I was not aware of the extent to which the European Union is active in promoting peace in over 30 countries around the world, and in promoting and defending human rights. Human rights, democracy, and the rule of law are, of course, in the DNA of the European Union. They're in the treaties, right at the very beginning. Article 2 of the Treaty on the European Union states, "The Union is founded on the values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities." And Article 49 makes it a condition for membership of the European Union that states respect those rights and commit to promote them. And Article 21 makes it even more explicit that these are the values that underpin the European Union's action in the international space. Now, while human rights, democracy, and the rule of law are the foundation stones on which the European Union is built, they are not themselves European values. And I think it is a mistake for people to talk about these values as European values. They're universal values. They belong to people everywhere in the world. They're not some kind of a European export product. They're enshrined in the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. And insofar as there is a European background to that, it is that the Universal Declaration itself was a response to the enormous human rights atrocities which occurred mainly in Europe during and before World War II. So what I want to do today is I want to address 4 questions. Firstly, what does the European Union do to promote human rights in the world? Secondly, what is my role as the European Union Special Representative in that effort? Thirdly, what are we planning to do over the next couple of years? And fourthly, what are the big challenges facing us? And then after that, I'll answer whatever questions you and the participants want to put to me. So what do we do? Well, first of all, I think it's important that when we talk about the European Union in this context, we're not just talking about the Brussels-based institutions. We're talking about the member states, because the human rights, the work that we do on human rights throughout the world is part of the common foreign and security policy of the Union, which must be agreed by the member states. It's one of the few areas that has to be agreed by unanimity. So it's very, very much in the possession of the member states. And we do it across a number of areas. First of all, in the multilateral space, because we're very strong supporters of multilateralism, and indeed the Council recently adopted a new statement on multilateralism. So we support the UN system, particularly the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Some of that support is financial, a lot of it is political. I speak regularly with High Commissioner Bachelet. We also support bodies like the Council of Europe, the African Union, the ICC, and we're active in our work, particularly in the Human Rights Council. So let me give you a couple of examples. When the coup occurred in Myanmar at the beginning of February, it was the European Union which brought that issue to the Human Rights Council, looked for a special debate, had a special resolution on it, and has followed through on it. Back over the years, long before the election in August last, the European Union was leading on the issue of Belarus and drawing attention to the human rights abuses in that country. And over the last 2 years, when the Trump administration launched an attack on the International Criminal Court. And we should remember the International Criminal Court was established after the horrors of the Balkans and Rwanda to bring war criminals to justice. But because the Trump administration did not agree with the decision that the chief prosecutor made on Afghanistan and on Palestine, they decided to impose sanctions on the chief prosecutor and the chief administrator of the International Criminal Court. Now, sanctions is something that are used to address abusers of human rights. This is the first time that we've seen them used to address people who were investigating human rights abuses. But it was the European Union at that time that stood with the ICC and that took that issue to the United States. So that's on the multilateral front. On the bilateral front, we raise human rights issues all of the time in engagements with countries at high level, but we also do it on the ground. We have European Union delegations, over 140 of them throughout the world. In most of those, we have dedicated human rights officers, and those human rights officers work with their heads of delegations to bring issues to the governments, to speak with governments about big issues, about human rights practices in the individual countries, about individual cases. They meet with civil society. In some countries, that's not easy. It has to be in through the side door, I'm afraid. And of course, they also observe the trials of people where there are issues involved. Let me give you just one example of how that works. I remember some years ago, there was an incident shocking incident in Colombia where the army opened fire on unarmed protesters in Tumaco on the western coast of Colombia. And I was contacted by a lot of civil society organizations about it. And I contacted our delegation in Bogota at the time and said, look, we've got to do something about this. And they said, we're already on it. Antonio Garcia, a Spanish diplomat, who's then the human rights officer in the delegation, was already in Tumaco with representatives of embassies from a number of our member states. And in fact, at the very time I was ringing, he was actually attending the funerals of some of the people who had been killed. So we do the work on the ground and at high level. The third area where we pursue it is in trade. In every trade agreement that the European Union has with third countries, there's a human rights clause. And there's a monitoring mechanism in those trade agreements for following up on those human rights clauses. We have a scheme of preferences for countries, some of the poorer countries in the world who have tariff-free access to the European market, but on condition that they ratify and that they comply with a range of United Nations human rights conventions on human rights and on labour rights. And those trade preferences are monitored by monitoring missions which go to the countries, look at them, and sometimes we do have to withdraw the trade preferences, and that was a decision that was made last year in the case of Cambodia. The fourth area where we work in is in the promotion and defence of democracy. One of the main ways we do that is through election observation missions. For the last 5 years, we have observed national elections in 98 countries. And in addition to that, have engaged in electoral processes in over 900 cases, because it's not just about looking at the election, it's also about the follow-up that we do, the support that's provided for the electoral systems, for democratic systems, for media, and in some cases for the development of political parties in many countries. There is the work, of course, that is perhaps better known, the public diplomacy, the statements that are issued on cases, the council conclusions that are made by the Foreign Affairs Council, the public statements that are made by the High Representatives, and then more recently, the decision to adopt a global human rights sanctions regime. Sanctions are not new to the European Union. We've often had country-specific sanctions, for example, in the case of Russia, in the case of Myanmar, but this is new. This is where the European Union can impose sanctions for human rights or violations of international humanitarian law in any country where we have sufficient evidence, and the imposition of those sanctions has already started. The last Foreign Affairs Council, China, Russia, Belarus, Eritrea, Venezuela, Myanmar, and that will be an ongoing process. And of course, all of that is backed up with money. We provide a lot of finance. over the next 6 years or so, the European, what we call the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights, has a budget of 1.5 billion euros to support human rights and democracy in different parts of the world. On top of that, there is finance from the Foreign Policy Instrument. There is finance from both the development and humanitarian arms of the Union. The European Parliament did a report recently where they estimate that we spend about 800 million euros a year in promoting human rights and democracy in different parts of the world. How is that spent? Some of it is in direct support to international bodies. Some of it is for specific projects. Just to give an example of one, there's the Spotlight Initiative, 500 million euros to campaign on violence against women. There is support for national human rights institutions, training of judges, police officers, grants to civil society organizations to enable them to do their work. And very importantly, the support that we provide to human rights defenders on the ground, some of whom can find themselves in very, very difficult situations and have to be taken out of danger. And we work closely with organizations like Frontline Defenders, which is based in Dublin. And over the last 6 years, we have provided assistance to 46,000 human rights defenders throughout the world. So where do I fit into that? Where does the Special Representative fit into that role, into that work? The Office of the Special Representative was created in 2012. As I've mentioned, one predecessor, Stavros Lambrinidis, who was a former Foreign Minister of Greece. I'm appointed by the Member States. It's a decision that has to be taken by unanimity, and I've been honoured to be appointed initially in 2019, and my mandate renewed just recently. I'm nominated by the High Representative. I have 2 channels of reporting. I report directly to the High Representative, and I also report to the Member States through the Political and Security Committee. And of course, I go to the European Parliament regularly also to account for my stewardship. What do I do? 2 things really. One is we're doing a lot, but it has to be pulled together and given coherence. So that's part of my responsibility. And secondly, I do political engagement. I suppose it is the question of who speaks for the European Union on human rights issues, who engages with other governments. So we do human rights dialogues. We have about 60 of them, which are annual events with different countries. I don't do them all. I chair probably usually the ones where there is ministerial participation on the other side, and some of the bigger ones and the ones with regional organizations. So in the recent past, it's been the African Union, Cuba, Mexico, Armenia just week before last, and Azerbaijan next week. We tend to do the 2 of those in harmony. I represent the European Union at international events, usually ministerial level meetings on human rights issues. I've done 120 or so of those over the last 2 years. Examples, the UK and Canada, conference on media, ministerial conference on media freedom in London, the United States and Poland, ministerial events on freedom of religion or belief, UN events like on Belarus recently. I've one coming up soon. The Portuguese presidency, in cooperation with the OSCE, are organising a major international conference on the death penalty. And just last week, just this week actually, Wednesday, I addressed, along with High Commissioner Bachelet, addressed the opening of the this year's session of the African Commission for Human and People's Rights. I also talk with governments. I talk with ministers. So when, for example, the Trump administration was attacking the ICC, I spoke with the then Assistant Secretary of State, who had responsibility for human rights and democracy in the US administration. I've been speaking recently with the new acting Assistant Secretary, and also with the coordinator for human rights issues in the National Security Council. And I'm really delighted that the new US administration has withdrawn the sanctions against the ICC. Over the last couple of months, I've been talking a lot with ministers in Ethiopia, the Minister for Women, about the rape that is taking place in Tigray. The Minister for Finance, who was in Brussels, took the opportunity of talking to him about the human rights situation in the country, the head of their Human Rights Commission. And of course, I've been working closely with the Foreign Minister of Finland who has been visiting that country. Next week, the Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine is in Brussels, so I will be meeting with him. I've been talking recently with both the Commerce Minister and the Human Rights Minister of Pakistan about their compliance and some issues we have about their compliance with the conventions for the trade preferences. And of course, during the COVID crisis, I've also been taking the opportunity to pick up the phone to ministers in different countries, particularly about the issue of prisoners and the release of prisoners. I meet also regularly with civil society, particularly with the major international NGOs who work on human rights, like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, and indeed also Frontline Defenders. Later this evening, for example, I will have a briefing from Human Rights Watch. They're producing a new report on the situation in Xinjiang in China, and I will be meeting with them to get a briefing on that report. And then next week, I will also be meeting with the World Uyghur Congress. I've spoken recently, for example, with Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, Belarus, who of course has very warm feelings for Ireland from the time that she spent with a family in Roscrea. The nature of my work, however, has been changing because of the COVID situation. I suppose pre-COVID, the normal modus operandi was to go and physically attend international conferences. If there are human rights issues in a country, go on a country visit and meet with the government. But since the COVID crisis, we've had to do all of this virtually. And a couple of things, I think, just observations on that. First of all, we're actually doing it virtually in terms of volume, dealing with more country situations and more issues that we're dealing with. Some of that, of course, is because the COVID crisis has thrown up more human rights issues that have to be dealt with. But I would also say that the quality is not the same. Doing a human rights dialogue, for example, on a virtual format is not the same as being able to do that in person, to develop the personal relationships with the people across the table, and more importantly, perhaps, to be able to speak sometimes privately with ministers from governments about particular cases and particularly about individual cases. So what are we planning to do over the next period ahead? Well, in November, the Council adopted a new action plan on human rights and democracy. This had been going through the Commission and the External Action Service and been discussed with member states really over the course of the past year, and was adopted by unanimity by the Council in November. One of the important things about that document was that it was choreographed with a number of other internal documents. That is about the human rights situation internally in the European Union. So there's the Democracy Action Plan, there's the Gender Action Plan, and there's the new Rule of Law mechanism. The Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy is built on 5 pillars. Firstly, empowering individuals. It's about the individual. Secondly, about building democratic, inclusive and resilient societies. Thirdly, building a global system or strengthening the global system that works on human rights, the multilateral system. Fourthly, addressing the challenges of new technologies, and I'll come back to that later. And then fifthly, doing it together. In other words, doing it in a joined up way between all of the institutions, the member states, civil society, private sector, and of course the European Parliament. I think one of the significant things about the action plan was that it's recent. It's been agreed unanimously by all 27 member states. It's a comprehensive statement of where we stand on human rights issues and what we plan to do about them. And therefore, I think it is quite a powerful document. But a plan is only a document unless it's implemented. And the High Representative has been very clear that he wants this plan implemented. So the plan assigns to me a key political role for guiding the implementation of the plan, and it sets down a timetable and targets that we have to meet. We've already started. The adoption of the global human rights sanctions regime was one of the commitments in the plan. We are launching it regionally, not just a central launch, but we've done one in the Americas. We have one next week for the eastern part of Europe and Central Asia. We've one the following week for the Asia Pacific region. The plan talks about the necessity to provide training for those who are working on human rights issues in our delegations. We've already started that process. We've been doing some of that all along anyway, but we've recently had an event where we brought human rights focal points together, and I spoke with them, and people from within the system also spoken for them. And very critically, we have started a process of doing individual country strategies. Then that work is actually underway at the moment, because the situation, the human rights situation, varies from country to country. There isn't a one-size-fits-all in addressing the human rights situation around the ground. We have to do it country by country. So in each individual country, where we have a European Union delegation, the work is underway at the moment with the embassies of the member states, with civil society, with the other people that we talk to develop a specific country strategy geared to that. And then we have a mechanism whereby we will follow up on that each year with reports on that strategy. What are the challenges that we face? I've mentioned technology. I think we have to look at this in two ways. First of all, there are the risks that new technologies are posing to human rights. For example, in relation to surveillance and the way in which some states are using technologies to effectively control their own people. But also I think we have to look at it from the point of view of the potential that there is in new technologies to help in the promotion of human rights and the defense of human rights around the world. The ability, for example, now to document in real time what is happening, some of the violations of human rights and international humanitarian law, and to produce the evidence that will be able to bring some of the perpetrators to account. Second challenge is the issue of climate change and human rights. Some of the biggest problems that we're facing are with environmental human rights defenders, many of whom are women and who are coming under enormous pressure in many parts of the world. So climate change and human rights defenders and human rights, particularly in relation to human rights defenders, is going to be a key issue that we'll be working on over the next couple of years. Business and human rights. For the first time, the European Action Plan has addressed the issue of business and human rights. You know, the components of our mobile phones, where do they come from? What is the human rights situation in those countries? The garments that we buy in supermarkets, you know, where does the raw material come from? What are the labor conditions? One of the things I think that is quite encouraging is that many parts of the private sector are taking a keener interest in the supply chain and in the human rights as it relates to the supply chain. So we're going to be doing quite a lot of work on this over the next year, not least because Commissioner Reynders is also planning on bringing forward European due diligence legislation in relation to the supply chain. I'm due to give a lecture on this issue on business and human rights in the Human Rights Centre in NUI Galway later this month. So I will have more to say about that issue at that time. But I think one of the things we do need to look at here is that, you know, while we the involvement of the consumer in human rights issues is not going to be a one-way street. And we've seen this very recently, for example, the campaign that was mounted by the youth wing of the Chinese Communist Party. This online campaign targeting H&M because they said they won't take cotton from Xinjiang, and Nike because they also raised some questions about the Uyghur issue. So this isn't going to be a one-way street, and it's something that we have to give a lot of thought to in the period ahead. COVID, of course, we have lived through a year and a quarter now, like no other in our lifetime. It has profoundly impacted on all of our lives. The COVID-19 pandemic has magnified every existing inequality in societies. It has worsened existing human rights problems, and it has generated its own human rights challenges. But the pandemic has also, I think, shown that the universality, indivisibility, and interdependence of human rights. To protect life and health, we need to ensure that many rights, including access to information, safe drinking water, food and housing, are all addressed. Human rights must be central to how we recover from this crisis. And that recovery is likely, I think, to be in three stages. First of all, there's the health recovery, which it's a work in progress at the moment. There will be the whole economic and fiscal recovery that will be required. But there is also the unwinding of the measures that were taken, many of the emergency measures which were taken, and which have restricted freedoms as a consequence of the COVID crisis. 107 countries declared states of emergency. 56 countries introduced measures that affect freedom of expression. 139 countries introduced measures that affect freedom of assembly. And 59 countries introduced measures that affect privacy. We have always said that yes, emergency measures are allowable in circumstances where there's a health emergency, but that those measures should be only those that are absolutely necessary, that they should be proportionate, be time-bound, and subject to democratic accountability. More generally, looking across the world, what is the big challenge that I see to human rights and democracy? It is the rise in authoritarianism. We're seeing increased assertiveness by regimes that have been authoritarian for a long time, but we're also seeing a trend towards more authoritarian rule in many countries. VDEM, which stands for Varieties of Democracy, which has been monitoring the health of democracy across the world and monitoring it over time, has recently produced its 2021 report. And the conclusions are very worrying indeed. Between what they call closed autocracies and electoral autocracies, there are now 87 countries, majority of the countries in the world, with authoritarian rule of some kind. That is home to 68% of the entire population of the world. At the other end of the spectrum, over the last 10 years, fully liberal democracies like our own, and I think we're ranked 12th, I think, in their league table, have reduced from 41 to 32 and now represent only 14% of the world population. And these trends are not just about forms of government, because authoritarian rule brings with it the intimidation and suppression of political opposition, the closing down of space for civil society, restrictions on media and freedom of expression, the targeting of minorities like LGBT, ethnic, national, religious minorities, pushback on the rights of women, starting usually with sexual and reproductive rights. I'm a skeptic when it comes to looking at some of the measurements that are used in these reports, but they have a measurement for what they call the average citizen's enjoyment of freedom and rights. And while you can question whether there is such a thing as an average citizen, certainly across the world, but it's an interesting measurement because of the trend that it shows. And what it shows us is that in 2020, the enjoyment of those rights, when averaged out across the world, is back down to where it was in 1990, around the fall of the Berlin Wall. So we are living through a time, therefore, when the struggle to protect and defend human rights is somewhat uphill. But I'm not entirely despondent, because we're also seeing some progress. For example, on the death penalty, last year the number of countries carrying out executions was down to 20 for the first time. Still a bit to go, but it's progress. The rejoining by the United States of the multilateral system, including their re-engagement with the Human Rights Council, is to be welcomed. The European Union itself launched an initiative 2 years ago, what we call the Good Human Rights Stories Initiative, which was basically to promote a more positive narrative about human rights, to identify where good things are happening, and we plan on relaunching that again, hopefully at the General Assembly in September, provided we can do that in person by that time. And we're of course intensifying the work that we're doing on human rights. But we're doing a lot. We need to do more. We need to do it better, and we probably need to do it together. States are required to not just to respect human rights, but to promote them in their external work. And it always makes me proud that this country, that Ireland, has always provided leadership consistently right across governments of different hues in pursuing the human rights and democracy agenda. And that continues to this day. And I couldn't let this opportunity pass without putting on record my appreciation for the support which I received from the Irish government for my mandate and for my work, and particularly the support and encouragement that I get from Minister Simon Coveney. So I leave that. I leave it at that, Andy, and respond to any questions that you have.
Thank you very much, Eamon. I appreciate very much the comprehensive and very clear presentation you've just given us. And I'm astounded by the huge amount of work on your plate over such a broad area. You mentioned that you work not just for the EU institutions in Brussels, but also for the EU member states, all 27 of them. And I'll just take this opportunity to ask a first question. Do you also look at the human rights situation in the member states, in the EU?
No, my role is external. I'm part of the foreign policy external action of the European Union. But of course, I don't ignore what is happening internally, because, as I always say when I'm talking with the member states, our credibility in promoting human rights abroad is also based on what we do at home. And other countries are very quick to raise with us, and rightly so, where they see that there are transgressions of human rights within the European Union and in member states. I should say that, again, a plug again, perhaps for another Irish colleague, the work that the Fundamental Rights Agency, which is based in Vienna, and which is charged with looking at how the Charter on Fundamental Rights is being implemented, is hugely important, and I get a lot of information from that, and I work very closely with my good friend Michael O'Flaherty, who is the head of that agency, and of course who has an outstanding human rights record in Ireland.
Yes, thank you, Eamon. And ladies and gentlemen, let me remind you of the possibility of asking questions. Please send your questions to events@europeanmovement.ie. And you can see that once again at the bottom of your screen. I have a first question here by Connor Gibbons, and he's asking you about to say a little bit more about the relationship between EU trade policy and EU human rights policy. You touched briefly on that, I believe.
Yes, well, it's really at two levels. First of all, the European Union has trade agreements with many countries and with groups of countries in different parts of the world. A standard provision in all of those trade agreements relates to human rights and observance of human rights. And each of those trade agreements provide for follow-up action. In some cases, they provide mechanisms for the discussion between the European Union and the individual countries. So observance of human rights is part and parcel of every trade agreement. And then secondly, we have this system of trade preferences, GSP, General Scheme of Preferences, which gives access to the European market for poor countries and then countries as they develop economically. And that scheme of preferences is contingent on observance of certain international conventions on human rights and labour rights. The trade preferences have been withdrawn on some occasions. A few years ago, in the case of Sri Lanka, more recently, a partial withdrawal in Cambodia. Two countries that are under scrutiny at the moment are Myanmar and Bangladesh, and that's obviously something that will be worked on over time. But it also gives us an opportunity. It gives us a way also of talking with, for example, Pakistan. I mentioned Pakistan earlier. Pakistan is one of the biggest beneficiaries of the trade preferences regime. And it gives us very, very strong leverage when we talk with the government of Pakistan about human rights issues. And we have done that, and I've referenced some of the meetings that I've had, for example, with Pakistan ministers about their observance of the human rights clauses of the trade preferences.
Maybe, Eamon, a follow-up question on this topic. I have a question here from Rick Hersefort of the Committee on Human Rights in North Korea. And he's asking the question, the recent EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, a trade agreement, What's your take on that in the light of China's human rights violations and record?
Well, first of all, you said North Korea, did you, Andy?
Yes, this gentleman works for the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. He's the EU representative.
Yeah, well, let me say, first of all, that we've been giving particular attention to North Korea. And in fact, at the recent session of the Human Rights Council in Geneva, again, the European Union led on a resolution on North Korea. So we're giving attention to that. The recently negotiated investment agreement with China, first of all, that has to be ratified. A lot of processes by which it has to go through, including the European Parliament. As I understand it, it's an agreement. In this case, it's not a broad trade agreement like the other ones that we've been talking about. It's more an agreement which is about investment by European companies in China. So it's an agreement, if you like, that has more benefits to the European side than it does to the China side. This question always arises about trade agreements. Should we have trade agreements at all with countries where there are poor human rights records? And I know it becomes part of the debate in parliaments and so on. And I would take the view that the existence of a trade agreement actually provides us with more leverage to engage with these countries on human rights issues. So it works actually the other way around. Now, I don't want to anticipate what will be decided. I expect there'll be quite an intense debate about this particular agreement, not least because of what has been happening in China, Hong Kong, the Uyghur situation, Xinjiang, Tibet, and of course the over-the-top response from China to the sanctions that were imposed in respect of a number of Chinese officials by the Foreign Affairs Council.
Thank you, Eamon. Maybe a sort of related area. You spoke briefly about new technologies. And I have a question here from Anna Mutanen. She's the deputy head of the Finnish embassy in Dublin. And she's asking about the theme of new technologies and how they could help to enhance human rights, both online and offline.
Well, I think we do have to look at this, not just, there is a tendency when we talk about new technologies and human rights to look at it from the abuse of technology and the risks that there are in relation to privacy and in relation to surveillance and what states can do now with technology. But I think we also have to look at it from the perspective of the liberating potential that there is in new technology for individuals. If you take, for example, the way in which human rights defenders work in many parts of the world, and often working in very remote locations, environments where very little infrastructure and very little presence of the state sometimes. Having a mobile phone, having an iPad, being able to connect, being able to find somewhere to connect, being able to report serious violations of human rights in real time, and perhaps being able to get a response, being able to record evidence which can be used in subsequent investigations. If you look, for example, at the potential, one of the areas which has been, I think, is the whole area of internally displaced people and what happens, the use of satellite technology. It's very hard. It's becoming increasingly hard to hide human rights abuses. And I think this is something that perpetrators of human rights abuses and perpetrators of international humanitarian law have got to come to understand. One of the, just short, one of the things I was fascinated was a visit I made to the International Commission for Missing Persons in The Hague. And I visited their laboratories and I saw what they're doing in assembling DNA evidence. They showed me, for example, what they did on the investigations on Srebrenica, and where that crime, the attempt that was made to cover it up by basically digging up the bodies, digging up the mass graves and reburying them in 18 places. And they were able to show me that in a particular case, particular body, they were reburied in 18 different places. They were able to reassemble. So you combine that, the science that is available, the satellite technologies that are available, the mobile communications technologies that are available, the speed of it. There is huge potential to use these potentials, I think, more creatively and more commonly in what you can get immediately now. The kind of evidence that might have taken a UN rapporteur 6 months to assemble.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Eamon. On a slightly different note, more maybe related to business, I have a question from a gentleman called Hervé de Huerguivos, who represents the Irish Coalition for Business and Human Rights. And he's asking a question about something you mentioned, the UN, a UN treaty on human rights law and the activities of transnational corporations. And he's wondering what our position is on that and whether we can provide more support to it.
Well, we are participating in the discussions that are taking place on this in Geneva. The idea basically is that there should be a binding treaty. But this is one of those cases, I think, where we have to walk before we can run. There are already guiding principles that have been adopted by the United Nations on business and human rights, and those guiding principles are required to be put into operation by individual states through national plans. To date, only about, I think it's actually less than 30, certainly not countries have adopted national plans, and half of those are European Union member states. So we've got to get more traction on the UN guiding principles. We also have to see more participation particularly by developed countries in the discussions on the idea of a binding treaty. And we also have to get more clarity. Now, I think we are getting closer to it, more clarity that these, the initial proposal for this binding treaty applied only to multinational companies. You know, there's a lot of business that are not multinational companies, including in some countries with authoritarian regimes, big state organizations, which would not be covered by that definition. So there is work that has to be done on this. The European Union is participating in it, but we're not confining our work just to those discussions. We're also working on the National Action Plans and the guiding principles, and as I said earlier, on the development of European Union legislation on due diligence in the supply chain.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we can shift to a bit more of a practical question, which I'm getting here from Jerry Arthurs. He's wondering if you could speak a little bit about the institutional dynamics of your work with regard to the European External Action Service and the, as you mentioned, 140 EU delegations around the world.
Well, my office is physically located in the office of the European External Action Service, and I work very closely with the EEAS, and there is an entire division in the EEAS that concentrates on human rights and democracy and on global issues, and I work very, very closely with them, and that's probably my closest working relationship. Mm-hmm. But also I work closely with the geographic divisions of the External Action Service, the different managing directors and Secretary General and Deputy Secretary General, and of course the High Representative and his cabinet. But it's not purely an External Action Service role. It's a role that also involves the rest of the Commission, and there are a number: the development, DG ECHO, the humanitarian side, particularly in relation to my responsibilities on international humanitarian law, trade that we've been talking about, DG NEAR, because of course the whole issue of accession. So I work closely with across the Commission, but I am a creature, or my office is a creature of the member states. It's established by the member states. My staff are seconded by member states, but I have a good work, and I have the level of cooperation that I get from both the offices in Brussels and particularly from the delegations on the ground. I pay very close attention to that because it was one of the things that I learned in my experience of working on the peace process in Colombia, just the importance of the delegation and how they know what's happening on the ground, and they have they have great engagement. And I always talk when I'm dealing with an individual country, always talk with the head of the delegation, and get the local angle.
Thank you. You mentioned that you work with also the geographical departments of the European External Action Service, and I have a few questions about specific geographic situations. A lady called Rokshin is asking about if you could comment on the outcome of recent human rights dialogue with India, and what steps you'll be taking in the future regarding India.
Yeah. Well, first of all, when I was talking earlier, I said that I don't participate myself in every human rights dialogue. And this was one in which I didn't participate. Okay. It was held physically in Delhi last Monday, actually. And the number of people involved were limited because of the COVID situation. The significance of that dialogue is that it is the first dialogue on human rights that we've had with India for 7 years. We've had little or no engagement with India, not because we didn't want to, but at the last summit between the leaders of the EU, President Michel, President von der Leyen, High Representative Borrell, and India in July of last year, it was agreed that the human rights dialogue would be revived, and that it would be revived at a local level, that it would be done by the head of delegation in India. I've received a report from that dialogue. I hope one of the ways of following up on it is that I hope that when the COVID situation allows it, that I will be able to go to India, because it is a country that I would like to have a really good discussion with India. I've had a number of meetings in Brussels with the Indian ambassador, who's based in Brussels, the ambassador to the European Union. The India view is that they're the world's largest democracy. If they are, the European Union is the second largest democracy, so there's certainly a lot to talk about. But there have been some human rights issues that we've been concerned about in India, which were discussed during the dialogue. As I said, it took place on Monday. I will be talking with the head of delegation in India in more detail about it and following through on it.
Okay. Another geographical question I'm getting here from Deglon de Bradoun. He's a freelance journalist. He's wondering whether you can bring us up to date on the Colombian peace process and whether you see any parallels to the Good Friday process in Northern Ireland.
Well, let me say hello to Deglon. Deglon and I have soldiered together over the years. Well, I laboured in the trenches in Irish politics, and Deglon covered it always fairly, I have to say. So Deglon, great to hear from you. Yes, on the Colombian peace process. Well, first of all, I think overall it has to be said that the Colombian peace process is a success. It did bring to an end a conflict which lasted for more than 50 years. FARC, which was the main guerrilla organization, laid down their weapons, did it within a very short period of time, have incorporated into Colombian society, established a political party, and that side of it has worked very, very well. It's a very comprehensive agreement, and not all of it has been implemented, and it will take time. And we have been encouraging the Colombian government to implement it in its full. One area which had a rocky start, but which is doing reasonably well now, is the transitional justice system. The transitional justice made a number of key decisions in recent times, one in relation to the leadership of FARC and their accountability, for kidnappings and for other acts that were committed during the conflict, but also in relation to the Colombian security forces and the Colombian army. So that's progressing. There is still violence, however, in the country. A lot of it is violence that's related to the drug trade. It's in remote parts of the country, areas where the state has very little presence, and that is a huge worry. If I weren't a special envoy for the peace process in Colombia, Colombia would be a priority for me anyway, as special representative for human rights, because we are seeing more human rights defenders being killed in Colombia than in most other parts of the world, and it is really it's really concerning. And we keep in very close contact with the Colombian government about it. There are parallels with the Good Friday Agreement. There are differences. There were different conflicts, different types of conflict. I think probably, and I've said this before, I think probably one of the strengths of the Colombian Agreement over the Northern Ireland Agreement was the emphasis which the Colombian Agreement put on victims and the involvement of victims in the negotiations in Havana, where again I had the great privilege to participate in the latter part of that process.
Yeah. Allow me to stay still in this sort of geographic discussion and raise another sensitive area. Aidan O'Sullivan is asking if you could give us an update on the human rights situation in Israel and Palestine.
Well, I've had, just before, one of the areas where I wanted to, again, do country visit was Israel and Palestine, and we have a special representative for the Middle East peace process, Susanna Tersto. She's in the process of leaving that role now and will be replaced. But Susanna and I had planned on doing a joint visit to Israel and Palestine. And indeed, in preparation for that, I had meetings with both the Israel ambassador in Brussels and the Palestine ambassador in Brussels just before Christmas. There were virtual meetings, obviously, to make some preparation for that. So that is an area certainly that I am giving attention to, and I hope again when circumstances allows to actually go there directly and to see more of it at first hand.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned in one of your topics the role that youth wings of political parties, like in China, can play, and I have Neve here who's asking, what advice would you give to young people wanting to get involved in EU human rights activism organizations?
Well, I think I've always encouraged young people to get involved. I was very young myself when I started to get involved in political issues and student unions and so on. So I would always encourage involvement. I think there are many ways in which it can be done. Involvement in civil society organizations, and there are many of them, some of them which are broad and general, and some of which are on specific issues. Involvement through volunteering to work on projects abroad. The Irish Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Irish Ireland Aid, which is part of that, has many opportunities, and of course many of the NGOs have opportunities to become involved, and to become involved, I think, also in campaigns. The voice of civil society. I think that one of the things I think we need to do about human rights is to perhaps make the language maybe a bit more accessible at times, and also to make it less of an area for specialists. Human rights are about people and about the rights of individuals and the rights of people and the rights of communities. I think sometimes we talk about it in a language that only the human rights experts and lawyers, diplomats can relate to. And I think that one of the things that we have to do is to broaden that. And I think the involvement of people in civil society organisations in particular and in campaigns is really important. And I think that participation by young people in that is very important and always very refreshing. I mean, always bringing a fresh look and an enthusiasm to what we do, and challenging also. Maybe some of the practices that some of our older have kind of come to accept. So I think that's a really important. It's really important that we see more young people involved.
I have a related question from Frank Dempsey about trade unions. And he's wondering, how can trade unions in developing countries be expected to play a positive role in enhancing human rights, whereas, in Western economies, the role of trade unions is in decline?
Well, that is very true. And when I started, I remember when I started working as a trade union official in Ireland, 2/3 of the workforce were organised in trade unions. I think it's now down to around 25%, and I think it's concentrated mainly in public sector and some of the more traditional industries. So we have seen a big decline in trade union membership in developed countries. We've also seen a resistance to trade union. The right to organise is one of the human rights, civil and political rights, that is being challenged. In work that I do when I visit countries, I always try to talk with trade unions. The situation varies from country to country as to how active they are. I think the role of the international trade union federations is very important. Some of them are sectoral federations, and I think also the work of the International Labour Organization. Let me just give you one example where I had some recent involvement. In fact, one of the last countries that I visited before the lockdown was Qatar, and I went there for a conference. But because I was going there for the conference, I insisted that I wanted to see what was happening with the preparations for the World Cup. And I met with there's an International Labour Organization office in Qatar, which has done great work, and a lot of progress has been made. And I think we'll probably be hearing a lot more about the situation in Qatar between now and the middle of next year when the World Cup takes place there. But I also went to the building sites. I'm a former trade union official. And I went to the sites to look at the working conditions, issues related to safety. Now, in a short visit, you don't see everything. But the international trade union federations have been very much involved, and we're helping the International Labour Organization with that work. I think that if we can just make this point, very often I think we focus, a lot of our focus on human rights is on the civil and political side. And I think we need to give more attention, and certainly I've been trying to give more attention to the social and economic side. And on the social and economic side, to labour rights, to working conditions. One of the first questions I will ask in any country is about working conditions, and how free are people to join a trade union? And it's one of my litmus tests. And again, it varies from place to place. So the role, I think, particularly of the International Trade Union Federation, I think is very important.
Okay, thank you very much, Eamon. I recall that in your presentation, you briefly referred to the way COVID has been affecting your work in the past year during the pandemic. And maybe as a final question, how do you think the COVID pandemic will affect, the human rights situation? Not just now, but as we move forward in the future, trying to cope with vaccinations and reopenings?
Well, I think vaccinations itself is a human rights issue. I think the access to the vaccine, and again, this is something that the European Union has been very conscious of. High Representative Borrell wrote a blog about this recently, about None of us are safe until everybody is safe. And, you know, the provision has been made in the EU's approach to vaccination to support COVAX and to ensure that the vaccine is made available to countries. And, you know, we've contracted as a European Union for the purchase of 2.6 billion vaccines. We're not going to need 2.6 billion vaccines in the European Union. So therefore, that includes a very large proportion of vaccines which will be available to the rest of the world. I think there are a number of things on the COVID. I mean, first of all, I think the COVID issue itself was a human rights issue, because it's essentially about right to life. It's about access to healthcare. I think the actual health issue itself is a human rights issue. I think it has opened up some existing scars. I think have been one of the ones I think which is really disturbing is violence against women, domestic violence. And that's why, for example, the recent decision by Turkey to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention is so retrograde, particularly during a period of COVID when we're seeing so much violence against women and domestic violence re-emerging. That's one of the consequences. I think also, obviously, when I referred to it earlier, the various emergency measures that have been taken. I think inequalities. You know, I think a lot of attention is going to have to be paid post-COVID to addressing issues of economic and social inequality that have been exacerbated by the COVID situation, and in all countries. It's not you know, it's not in third countries. It's, I think, right here in the European Union as well. There's the emergency legislation issues, but I think also looking at it more positively. I think what COVID has shown us is just how small the world is and how we're all so interdependent on each other. This is a global crisis that the entire world has had to cope with together. And, you know, we can be critical about how it's been handled and about, you know, different aspects of it and so on. But what we are actually seeing is we're seeing a global effort by people to try and get on top of this. You know, it's the first time I think that we have seen this kind of global human crisis and this global human effort to deal with a crisis. And I think there are lessons that we can learn from our experience of dealing with this COVID crisis that can be used in the future in dealing with other health or environmental crises, that can be, I think, applied in how we address the issue of climate change. And I think in a way, it is. In a way, I think it is a crisis that has the potential to bring us much closer together as a peoples around the world. So again, I think that we should. Yes, of course, there are difficulties, and we all know them, and vaccine nationalism, and, you know, things that shouldn't really be happening. But the global effort, and I think the importance, again, the multilateral side of it, the important role of the World Health Organization, and also the lessons to be learned that we must ensure that the international organizations that we have are, you know, that they're up to the job, and you know, that they're prepared for the crises that they have to deal with. So I think there are a lot of lessons that can be learned from it, and I hope that they will be.
Thank you very much, Eamon. I think that's a very hopeful message to end our discussion on. A very sincere and special thanks to you on our behalf for being so available, not just today to present your work to us, but also to engage so much in questions from the audience on you know, a wide range of issues. I'm extremely impressed by the fact that, you know, your work is so broad in scope, and also at the same time so deep in each and every area where you have to step in. And I think our audience is also very grateful that you were able to join us today in this presentation and discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, a big thank you to you as well for not just attending, but also participating in our webinar. And I'd also like to thank our friends at the European Movement in Ireland for their great help and working together with us today to make this webinar possible. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Eamon Gilmore, for your presentation, the EU Special Representative for Human Rights.